Welcome to the afternoon session of EdTech Korea from 2022, and we are going to now begin TRACK-A2. I hope that all of you enjoyed your lunch. And once again, thank you very much for your participation. The theme of this track is navigating tomorrow's pathways, narrowing learning gaps and strengthening social-emotional learning. And we are going to also listen to some presentations. So there was a National Academic Achievement Level Assessment in 2021, and the academic performance and satisfaction of school life were measured to be similar with last year. And this means the reduction in basic academic achievement and satisfaction with school life and students' confidence, value, interest, and desire to learn have not been recovered to the pre-pandemic level. When the academic loss is left unattended, it can lead to 3% decline in lifetime income and 1.5% drop of national GDP, according to OECD. It is highly worrisome that the academic loss may negatively impact national competitiveness as well as individual students' overall life. And that's why it is really important to address the issue of academic loss, also in terms of students' emotion and mentality. And in this session, we're going to have discussions on the ways to tackle the academic loss and ways to ensure social and emotional security of our students. We also have three presenters for this session. The first speaker is Emma Dorn, Senior Knowledge Expert and Associate Partner from McKinsey and Company Education. She will join us over Zoom. We also have another speaker, Professor Peck, Chair Professor from Institute of General Education from Korea University. The third speaker of the session is for this session. So we're going to listen to the first presentation, and the speaker is Emma Dorn from McKinsey and Company Education. And the title of her talk is Recovering COVID-19 Learning Delays. Can technology be part of the answer? And it's really important to have technology system which will assist students to be able to achieve what they want to achieve. Emma leads knowledge development and dissemination for McKinsey's education work around the globe, and she also serves clients across the public, private, and social sectors, including school systems, higher education institutions, technology companies, bilateral and multilateral donors, foundations, and education non-profit organizations. Emma's areas of focus include improving access to and quality of education for historically underserved populations, supporting efforts to meet the Sustainable Development Goal for Education (SDG 4), applying advanced analytics for social impact. So I'd like to ask Ms. Dorn to begin her presentation after the introductory video.
Please begin your presentation.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me here. It's a real privilege. Give me one moment while I share my screen. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about two things. The first is the impact of the pandemic on student learning, and then secondly, whether technology can be part of the answer to helping students to recover both from the academic impact but also the broader well-being impacts. So first of all, what has been the impact of the pandemic on student learning and well-being? As we all know, COVID-19 has disrupted schooling around the world. As we look here, what this chart shows is between 2020 and 2022, where schools were closed and open. And obviously the norm is that schools are fully open, the blue, or sometimes on academic break. And you can see that early in 2020, there was a large disruption, and that even coming to today, there are still school systems that are only partially open. And this has had a meaningful impact on student learning. Based on our analysis and evidence, we have looked that students around the world are approximately on average 8 months behind where they would have been absent the pandemic. But this is very different in different regions. And so in some regions, for example, in Europe or in North America, students may be 3 or 4 months behind. Whereas in Latin America and the Caribbean or South Asia, students may be well over a year behind. And remember that this is of a year of learning, which is 10 months, given the academic break. And so a 12-month delay is more than a year of learning. As we look across the world, not only has this the COVID pandemic impacted regions differently, it's also impacted countries within regions differently. And as we looked at countries, we really saw 3 different archetypes. The first archetype was high-performing countries here. These are high-income countries. In general, they closed for less time, and students in these countries had access to quality remote learning. It wasn't perfect. My own kids were in remote learning. Sometimes there were tears, but most children in these countries had connectivity, they had devices, they had teachers who were trained and able to deliver learning digitally. Even here, there were learning delays. In my home country of the United States, students are maybe half a year behind, and especially students who are historically disadvantaged are especially impacted. The second archetype of countries is low-income countries who were really challenged pre-COVID. Even before the pandemic, 9 out of 10 children in sub-Saharan Africa were not able to read a simple sentence by the time of 10. And interestingly, many of these low-income countries also did not close for very long. And so the main challenge here is addressing the challenges that pre-existed the pandemic. The third archetype of countries are those that have been most impacted by COVID-19 in the education space, and those are actually middle-income countries, and especially countries in South Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean. Some countries, middle-income countries, closed for as long as 2 years, and students there didn't have access to connectivity, remote learning, especially students in rural areas. The other thing to bear in mind is that the impact of the pandemic was not just academic. It was also broader than that. Globally, 83% of children and 89% of parents reported an increase in negative feelings since the pandemic. Children are at risk of dropping out of school. Children who were no longer doing sports gained weight and regressed in many different ways. We have not got data from every country, but we did an extensive parent survey in the United States and found that at the height of the pandemic, 1 in 3 parents were very or extremely worried about their child's mental health. This is just a tremendously sobering thought that 1 in 3 parents were very or extremely worried. And so as we begin to think about how to recover from the pandemic, we must think not only about the academic impact, but also some of the broader social, emotional, and mental health impacts that the pandemic has had on our young people. The other thing to bear in mind is as well as the pandemic impacting learning, the pandemic has also impacted the workplace, and especially in high-income countries where automation was already expected to increase the need for higher order skills, for applying expertise, for interacting with stakeholders, managing and developing people, and increase the need for higher levels of education for people with not just a high school education, but with undergraduate or master's level degrees. The pandemic has accelerated this shift to digital, and with it the need for new skills. So at the very same time as we have children graduating with fewer skills, we have a need for more skills in the workplace. There is clearly a big challenge for the education community across the world. And so the question here I would love to pose to the group is, can technology be part of the answer to supporting students in recovery? Obviously, the technology is not a silver bullet. We saw this in the pandemic itself, where the shift to online learning really put back student learning for many students. And yet technology, we believe, can be part of the answer. First, however, we must be nuanced. We must recognize that the impact of technology varies by both the device that's used, by the region, and even more importantly, how that device is used. And we'll come to that in a little bit. We did an analysis, this was prior to the pandemic, on the impact of technology on student learning. What we found here, and this is an analysis of the PISA survey data, as well as PISA's assessment results globally. And what we found is that students who had data projectors or internet-connected computers in the classroom tended to perform better than students who did not. Whereas students who were using laptops and tablets in the classroom tended actually to perform worse. Now, this doesn't mean that laptops and tablets are bad things. It just means that right now the implementation of these, if we look globally, is not what we would desire. And to give you a sense of the magnitude here, this is about 25 to 40 points is equivalent to a year of learning. And so using a tablet in the classroom is associated with somewhere between half a year and a full year less learning for those students who are using tablets. The other thing we looked at within the PISA data was how students were using, how the technology was actually being used in the classroom. Was it being used by the student only, by the teacher and the student, or the teacher only? And what we found is that technology in the hands of teachers was associated with higher outcomes than technology in the hands of students, at least as it was currently being implemented in countries. And this was true almost in every region of the world. There were a few regions where technology with the teacher and the student had a positive impact, but mostly student-only facing technology currently was having a negative impact. We also looked at what level of use of technology was associated with the highest student outcomes. And here we found something that was very interesting. For many different regions and many different subjects, the minutes per subject per week, which was associated with the highest student outcomes, was 0 minutes. But for some regions and for some countries in some subjects, the area was actually more than 60 minutes. And this, I think, points to a really important truth, which is that there is a learning curve with technology. And it may well be that it is not that the devices or the connectivity are the problem, it is the implementation. And so as we've been looking across how can technology be implemented effectively, we've seen some core beliefs in how this can be done well. And that it's not just about the devices, it's about the devices and the software that is on those devices and the professional development that's provided to teachers and the entire context. And that as students are able to use technology in a well-implemented situation, it can actually have positive impacts. So coming out now of the pandemic, where more students and more teachers have had more experience with technology, and where the technology has probably improved since the PISA results of a few years ago. As we were looking across the environment, we saw 6 different ways that technology could potentially be part of the solution. 2 of these are around learning directly. Technology can provide access to learning. This is very true in low and middle income countries where many students don't have access, but also in some high income countries in specific areas where students don't have access. And also, not only access, but quality, where technology can provide mastery-based, more personalized learning. The second major category is around teachers and teaching, where technology can help in teacher training, in real-time teacher coaching and scaffolding, and in freeing up teacher time so that teachers have more time to spend with students on social emotional learning and on one-on-one facilitation and support. And then finally, technology can also be helpful to support families in communication and the connection between school and home. So maybe I can spend the last few minutes of my presentation talking about each of these and some interesting innovations that are happening that then we'd be happy to discuss further in the questions. So first of all, in terms of access to learning, in many developing countries, there is very little access to quality instruction at all. And technology can be a powerful tool for access there, but it can also be a powerful tool for access in high-income countries where there are pockets where there is less access. And maybe 2 examples here. The first is access to specialized or advanced courses. And so in many rural areas, it is very difficult to find teachers, especially teachers who are extremely highly qualified in specific subjects. For example, in rural areas in the United States, it's very difficult to find teachers who are able to teach physics or chemistry at a high level. And so technology can increase the access to these kinds of courses with a facilitator in the classroom, but a highly qualified teacher who can provide some of the instruction remotely. For example, in the US, 47% of rural districts in the United States have no secondary students enrolled in AP classes. And AP classes are critical for gaining access to top universities within the country. The other place where technology can be helpful for access is actually remote learning, even when in person. And COVID really increased teachers' comfort with technology and teaching in hybrid environments. And so one potential way of applying this going forward is, historically, when students were suspended from school for discipline, they would spend 2 weeks at home without learning, and then they would return to school and they would be 2 weeks behind. And this created this endless cycle where students were behind, and then they ended up getting suspended. They came back, they were further behind, they didn't understand the content. They acted out because they weren't engaged by the content in the class anymore. And so being able to offer remote learning to students who are under disciplinary measures can enable continuity of learning. A second way that technology can potentially help is through providing mastery-based learning to help students learn at their own level. There's a great deal of research about the impact of teaching at the right level, and that if you can understand the level that students are at, can provide them with the next piece of content to enable them to progress to the next level, then pedagogy is going to be much more effective. And we have many different examples of technologies now that are able to do this, that are able to assess each child, that are able to see where the gaps are, both individually, but also for teachers to be able to see common gaps across students. So for example, at the beginning of a unit, a teacher can take a quick pop quiz of the students and understand which students have already mastered this content and need enrichment, which students have mastered the prerequisites but need to be taught on the content, and which students are actually missing pieces of prerequisites that they maybe need scaffolding and a little bit of catch-up and intervention. Some examples of some interesting technologies on this front. iReady is an interesting technology that really combines the formative assessment, but also the instruction, enabling for personalized tests and adaptive instruction. I think you've all now probably heard of Khan Academy. One of the interesting things that Khan is moving into is not just providing the videos and exercises and additional resources, but really understanding mastery and being able to assess where students are and provide them with the right next step. There are several other adaptive digital assessment and instruction platforms out there that are continually trying to refine to be able to provide students with the learning that they need. So a third area that we talked a little bit about was around parents. And one of the things that was really interesting in COVID is that parents became much more involved in their children's education. And what is interesting is, as parents were surveyed, there was actually a desire for many parents to continue to have that engagement, to continue to seek a better understanding of where their children are academically, to understand what material their children have mastered, where they need to continue to master further material. And one of the ways that technology can help is not just providing teachers with an eye into where every student is, but also providing parents into an eye to where their own student is, so that they can understand and ask when their student gets home, I see that your teacher has assigned you a history assignment. How are you doing on that? Or they can see the grades that their children are getting and have a conversation. Or they can see some of the material that their children are seeing. I think maybe one of the most powerful ways that technology can help, though, is not directly to students or to parents, but to teachers. And certainly the PISA assessment suggests that might be the case. So perhaps could tech-enabled teacher training simulate the classroom for a valuable and risk-free practice? One of the things that is well known in the education reform movement is that teachers in their first 2 years have a very quick learning curve and improve very quickly. But what that means is that in their first year, teachers are much less effective than they are in their second or third. And after that, the learning curve really flattens out, and a teacher in their 10th or 20th year is not so different. And so would there maybe be ways that technology could simulate the classroom for a variety of different skills around different learning characteristics, personalities, classroom management, so that teachers can get some of that initial learning curve out of the way on simulated children and not have real children in front of them while they're learning. I think the second way that technology can really help with teaching is to provide teachers with scaffolds and tools to ensure that there's really consistent, high quality instructional materials and instruction delivered to every child. And while this is potentially most impactful in low-income environments where teachers have potentially less training and higher class sizes, this kind of interactive and guided teacher supports can also be helpful in high-income countries, especially where it comes to being able to provide these formative assessments to students, to be able to group students perhaps into groups based upon the results of these assessments, and then tailor the instruction for each of these different groups. Finally, technology can actually save teachers time. And we all know that teachers are often overworked and have limited time to actually spend one-on-one with the students, which is what they love to do most. We did an analysis of the potential for time reallocation by activity that teachers do, and found that teachers could potentially save up to 30% of hours that are currently spent, especially in preparation, in evaluation and feedback, and in administrative responsibilities. And what this enables teachers to do is to spend more time on those things that only teachers can do. Some of the direct student engagement, student advising and coaching, and more of the behavioral and social and emotional skill development that really requires person to person. So I will wrap here. I think I maybe have 1 minute left, and I will pass over to the panel, but happy also to answer any questions that you have.
네, 발표 잘 들었습니다.
Thank you.
코비드19로 인한 학습 지연, 간급 이런 것들이
There has been the learning delay, and do you think that can be addressed by technology? Thank you for your insightful presentation. And I can see that all of you are participating very actively by posting comments and questions in the chat box. And we'll talk about those questions that you posted shortly after hearing the insightful presentation.
세 번째 발표죠.
Now let us move to the last presentation of TRACK-A-2. The next speaker is Ms. Kwon Yoo-jin, Associate Research Fellow from Korea Institute for Curriculum and Evaluation. And she will give us a talk on the topic of navigating tomorrow's pathways, narrowing learning gaps and strengthening social emotional learning. And Ms. Kwon has a unique experience of completing teacher training in the United States as well as a teacher qualification in Korea. And I'm certain that she'll be able to provide a lot of insight to the participants. Since 2010, she has been devoting herself to research curriculum and teaching and learning as a home study major at the Korea Institute for Curriculum and Evaluation, and it has been utilized as an education expert who has been participating in policy research at the national and provincial level.
안녕하세요.
Good afternoon.
평가원의
I'm
권유진이라고
Kwon Yujin
합니다.
from Korea Institute for
디지털
Curriculum
대전환
and
시대에
Evaluation.
저희가 핑크빛 학교를 생각해 볼 수 있지만
We
저는
can
오늘 이
always
시간에
dream
조금
of
어렵지만
quality
같이 고민해야 될 문제에
education
대해서
when the
생각해
times are
보자
tough, and I'd like to take this
학습
opportunity
격차입니다.
to
저희가
have a
코비드
conversation
19에서
on learning
원격
gap
수업이
in remote
시작되었고
class. Remote
격차에
classes
대해서
have been
공유해야 될 때가 된 것
operating
같아서 함께
because of the
고민해 보도록
COVID-19
하겠습니다.
pandemic.
아마 신문지상에서 많이 보셨을
I
겁니다.
think you're familiar with
저희가
the
학교가
recent news. There were many schools that were closed because of the pandemic, and a lot of classrooms had to shift to online classrooms, and that caused learning gap, and many are concerned about the widening learning gap.
실제 2021년도 학업 성취도 결과를 보면
There was a 2021 assessment on academic achievements, and there were increasing number of students who belong to the below basic level academic proficiency in almost all school subjects. And also we were able to identify reduction in students' qualitative achievements from the previous year, including their school life satisfaction, self-confidence, and learning motivation. When we talk about learning gap, does it mean only the achievement gap, or does it also mean education opportunity gap? And is it the same with the education gap? And maybe there is a gap between remote and face-to-face classrooms, and there could be also gaps between different students. Before the pandemic, usually learning gaps were identified, and there were a lot of studies mainly on learning gap that happens during summer vacation. It is all the more so because of the long summer vacation, especially in Western countries. And a lot of studies were conducted on learning gap caused by long summer vacation. And there are also studies on the gap in academic achievements and also on opportunity gap. But we also need to understand the difference between learning experience and learning outcomes. After the COVID-19, whenever we think about learning gaps, there are certain things that we need to pay attention to. When there were not so many remote classes with schools closed, remote classes that were used to be operated under special circumstances became commonplace. So we had existing studies on learning gap, for example, during summer vacation, but now we also have concerns on learning gap caused by a health crisis like COVID-19 pandemic. And we need to understand the learning gap caused by those unusual circumstances. Also need to explore a new meaning of learning gap. There are two aspects that we'd like to take a look at when we talk about learning gap. Basically, when we say education, that was usually the face-to-face classroom-based education, and there are differences when it comes to learning gap of the online classrooms and on-site education. Instead of just looking at the learning gaps experienced by some students, we also need to understand why some students suffer from learning gaps. Maybe it has to do with student characteristics and their home environment. And it also may have to do with strategies that teachers use for teaching and the students' learning. And unfortunately, we lack studies that reviews these elements, and it is really important to explore effective strategies to mitigate learning gaps in remote education. So in 2021, I teamed up with some of my colleagues in order to look at possible supportive measures to mitigate learning gaps in remote education. It is likely that we will experience yet another major health crisis in the future. It is really important to accumulate and collect relevant data. And of course, we have some surveys, and there were some previous qualitative studies, but we actually didn't have any studies that really looked at learning gaps and the influencing factors. And we wanted to have both quantitative and qualitative studies to identify solutions to reduce learning gaps. We conducted surveys as part of quantitative studies in 2021 in Daegu. There were no online classes, but we were able to conduct a survey with students and teachers, and we mainly surveyed 4th to 6th graders in Korea and middle school, 1st to 3rd graders. We also conducted classroom observations. We wanted to identify the influencing factors and transcribed the interview respondents, and we coded and reviewed, and we also derived and extracted review topics from those results. I'd like to share with you some of the findings from our study. We observed classroom operations in 9 schools, and we also interviewed the students and teachers. There were some differences between subjects. For the Korean language, students had to take the textbooks home, and they were unable to share their textbooks with other students, and the teachers were not able to observe the students solving problems. That's why the teacher had to mainly give a lecture during online classes. For English courses, for elementary students, it is really important for them to listen and repeat after the teacher, but because they had to wear the mask, even if they were in the same classroom, because also the teacher was wearing the mask, the students were not able to clearly hear the teacher's pronunciation, and the teacher had to repeat many times what he has to say. Now, I'm going to share with you some of the outcomes of our study. So we were able to identify some influencing factors for learning gaps. To be more specific, of course, most of the online classes took the form of real-time bidirectional communication. There were a lot of preparations to distribute and disseminate IC devices, and most teachers felt that they received sufficient support to strengthen digital competencies. There are some differences from school to school. However, most teachers believe that online classes can never replace face-to-face lectures, but more than 40% of the teachers responded that online classrooms can also substitute face-to-face lectures. But basically, majority of the teachers said that maybe having the online classrooms can provide us with the opportunity to improve the delivery of education. And most teachers believe that they're well equipped to provide classes online, but there were some people who also answered that they're less equipped, maybe because they are not familiar with the digital environment and they're not tech savvy. And there were also others who said that learning gaps are mainly caused because students have to look at the monitor for an extended amount of time. They are really tired. And for teachers, it's really difficult to check whether the students are following them. At the same time,
네, 그 자료를 그러니까 급하게 2020년부터 원격적으로
since online classrooms were introduced quite suddenly because of the pandemic, teachers had to quickly create teaching materials, and they also believed that they were not able to make full preparation to assist students when they were struggling to catch up with the learning content. And the teachers were worried about the lack of concentration of the students. We observed some classrooms and we also interviewed some teachers and students. And when we interviewed the students, some said that the online classes don't feel like they are learning. They felt it was like watching TV. And they also said that they did not like online classes because they cannot sit with their friends in the same classroom. And because they couldn't meet their friends, it was really a difficult time for them. And also teachers said that it's really hard to develop children's social skills. And during online classes, it's really difficult to ask questions because, of course, teachers do their best teaching, and sometimes there is problem with the internet connection, and it's really difficult for this teacher to give attention to all the students because the teachers are mainly watching their monitor or the screen. For elementary students, if they are sitting in a classroom, they will actively raise questions. But for older students, they're really conscious about the camera that is on, and they don't like to have their face shown on the screen. A lot of teachers complain that they only see the hair or upper part of the student's head. And there were some unexpected answers. Some students said that because they can always go back and watch the lectures again, they don't really see the need to concentrate on the lectures. And also some students liked online classes because if they're sitting in the back in an actual classroom, they only look at the back of their friends' heads, but on Zoom, the student can watch other students' faces. And for teachers, it will require a lot of time and effort to prepare for the online classes, and for them, it is really important to develop special strategies. And also, some teachers believe that there are some students who will require additional assistance, but because this is online, those special additional assistance cannot be provided. And because of the operation of the online classes, for teachers, it is really important to get support from other teachers and from the school. And there were cases that we were able to identify a lot of support provided by the school, and for one-on-one interviews. And there were some schools that really cared and really had one-on-one interviews with the students to see whether the students were satisfied with the online classes. I was able to identify some learning patterns, and there were some characteristics with teachers. Some teachers thought that online classes are effective, and there were also teachers who did not agree. And there were major differences between these two. Unfortunately, our study did not look at what made these two different groups of teachers have different opinions. But when it comes to learning gap, it is the difference between the desired outcomes and the outcomes that we actually get from the students. So if the desired outcomes match or the actual outcomes of the students' learning matches the desired outcomes. Of course, there is no learning gap, and we want to minimize that, whether it's because of the long summer vacation or whether it's because of the yet another health crisis. It can always cause academic loss. Of course, there was a major typhoon several weeks ago in Korea, so such a natural disaster can also cause a learning gap in Korea. So whenever it happens, we should make sure that the learning gaps are closed, and we should be able to provide opportunities for students to recover their learning. Of course, Professor Peck highlighted many times there should be both cognitive and emotional learning happening at the same time. And it is really important to understand how we can put these two different things together, and we also need to think about how we can combine these two for older students. And the teachers' social efficacy is really important. If it's low, it can negatively affect learning outcomes of the students. And students can have some difficulties in asking questions in remote classes, and we should be able to encourage them to ask questions. And there are some parents who provide active support, and that tend to lead to better learning outcomes. And self-directed learning also means that students can really concentrate on the lecture, and for students with lower self-directedness, those type of students require more support from school. Of course, we have to have rules and principles for online classes. If it's blended learning or if it's hybrid classroom, organizing online classrooms doesn't just mean changing the type of education delivery. It is not just switching the learning mode, and whether it's online or offline, we should ensure quality in learning. And it is really important to provide customized and individualized learning, individualized feedback. We should also encourage and should be highlighted in remote learning as well. And in remote learning, unlike the face-to-face lectures, we need to probably have new lesson design. We should be more flexibility in support as well. I've been trying to cover a lot of things for my presentation, so I think spoke quite quickly, but I will have to finish here, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. That was Kwon Yoo-jin from Korea Institute for Curriculum and Evaluation. She talked about how we can narrow learning gaps and how we can strengthen social emotional learning. It was really insightful presentation. We only have 10 minutes for a Q&A session, and we already have a lot of questions posted on YouTube. And some participants also sent us cheering messages. For example, as was mentioned by Ms. Kwon, there are of course pros and cons in remote learning. Of course, some teachers identified positive effects, and there were some others who criticizes the remote learning because of its negative impacts. And there are a lot of influencing factors of learning gaps, and some wrote, and that was also his comment, of course, schools were closed, but we were able to see the improvement of online education, and it could be applied in many different areas. We are back to face-to-face lectures, and it seems like we're once again stuck to the textbook. I hope that online classes will be provided as well, along with the classroom
classroom
lectures.
김윤환님은요.
Kim Yun-hwan wrote,
코로나로 인해 비대면 수업을 하면서
of course, because of the online education, we were not able to have face-to-face interactions with the
전달할 수 있었지만이죠.
students.
제가 다시 정정을 하겠습니다. 이런 내용은 잘 전달할 수 있었지만
Of course, we're able to deliver the education online, but maybe we're not able to help our students with their social skills because online classrooms have limitations in group-based activities. So different teachers have different opinions about online education. And also, one person wrote that she really likes the presentations and she's enjoying the forum. And Professor Jo Byuk's presentation was really good, and seems like he has a lot of fans in Korea. And some wrote that he watched his documentary on TV, and I was able to learn new perspectives on learning. I also was glad to hear Professor Jo's experience in teaching. Now it's time to entertain some of the questions raised by the participants. And we collected some questions before, and this question is directed to Ms. Dorn.
Technology is an important variable in the general formula for improving teaching and learning. In the case of remote places with difficult access to technology, what would be a good proposal for not let them behind because of their hinders related to IT infrastructure? Please.
Sorry, let me come off mute. Thank you so much for the question. I think you are right that it can sometimes be difficult to think about how technology can be applied in different contexts. And so as one is applying the technology, it is important to understand what is the technology that is already there and leverage that technology that exists, as well as then building for the longer term. An example of a technology that can be used in very remote contexts where there isn't connectivity would be an offline system. And so one example of this is Imagine Worldwide is a nonprofit that is working in very remote areas in Malawi where there is no connectivity. Sometimes there is not even electricity. And they are able to put on tablets that are very robust, that are solar paneled, a full set of adaptive basic literacy and numeracy instruction that students can access during the day. And then they can be charged at night using solar panels, and everything is offline. So it does not need any connectivity. And this particular solution has helped students in Malawi improve their learning by an equivalent of 8 months of learning in a year. And so I think that it shows that there is just a full continuum of different types of products that are available and different types of solutions that are available for different contexts. And it's important to make sure that you fit the solution to the context.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer. 네, 먼저 사전 질문을 소개를 해드렸고요.
So there was one question that we collected in advance, and there are many questions.
좋습니다, 교수님 좋습니다.
Emma Dunn, I appreciate many great statistics that you had. It's wonderful. But I especially like your last comment that teachers need to focus on things that machines can't do. I like that comment very much. Thank you.
Wonderful. 네, 교수님께서 말씀에 대한 코멘트까지 해주셨습니다. 응원의 메시지.
Professor Jo gave a comment to Ms. Dunn's speech, and he gave a complimentary remark to what Dunn said earlier. So let me give a question, Professor Jo. The teacher that can earn students' mind and communicate with students who is truly a happy teacher. So if teachers are to focus and concentrate on students for students' happiness,
지도해야 할까요?
Well, how should we guide the students and how should we guide the students so that they can concentrate their spirit and mind to where?
학생들을 어디에다가
Okay,
집중할까? 아주
where should we make students concentrate their spirits and mind on?
선생님께서 거기다가 집중하지 마세요.
Teachers don't concentrate on that.
학습의 즐거움,
What you should focus on how to deliver happiness of learning to students. If you focus on that, then students will naturally concentrate.
재밌고 막 그냥 신나고 그런
And study, I'm not saying that for students the studying should be fun and exciting. What I'm saying is that the pleasure of learning is what they've learned today, they find it really beneficial for them and that they feel that it's really helpful for them, for their self-development. So when they realize that, they will find a true pleasure. They'll find it really exciting. So how can we be happy? So I am sharing the feedback that I got online. So how can we feel happy and how can we make students instead of trying to make students to concentrate on something? If you focus on how to make students happy, then their good learning outcomes will naturally follow, right? Actually, the learning at school, it cannot always be fun and exciting. There can be part that's difficult. But what I realized while conducting the interview is teachers are interested in students, and teachers are interested in students' growth and learning. And if teachers are interested in students themselves, then they will concentrate and they will engage. Even though what they're learning is difficult, if they feel that teachers are interested in them and teachers are interested in their achievement, then they will naturally concentrate in classroom. If they feel that they are receiving a lot of interest and care, if they feel that kind of authenticity, then they will engage better during classrooms. So I think this can be applied not just to education, but to the personal relationship as well. Thank you to Sujin Yoon for good questions. We are a little bit behind our planned schedule, but let me ask 1 to 2 more questions that we got online. Emma Dunn, I think this is a very broad question.
Ms. Dorn, do you happen to know about the learning gap issue in Korea and have any specific solution to that? 자, 한국에 특별한 어떤 갭이 있을까요? 그러니까 우리나라뿐만 아니라 전 세계가
Of course, learning gap may be an issue, not just in Korea, but in also other countries, due in part to the COVID-19 pandemic. So do you have any knowledge on the Korean learning gap, and maybe you can share with us some of the solutions that you can think of for Korea?
Of course. So I'm not as familiar with the specific gaps in Korea, but what I do know is that if you look across the world, it is very sobering to see that social economic learning gaps have not actually narrowed in the past 20 years, despite many of the efforts in many different countries. And what is especially worrying is if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, it has widened gaps both within countries and also between countries. And so in almost every country that we studied, students from indigenous families, students from rural areas, students from low-income families, and students from historically disadvantaged racial and ethnic groups suffered more from the learning gaps from the pandemic. And so there are many things that we can do to help to counter this. And I think the first is focus. It is making sure that we focus our efforts, our finances, our best teachers on those students who need it most. And often the opposite happens. Often there is more financing for the high-income students. The best teachers go to the high-income schools. And so I think that is one thing we can do. I think the other thing we can do is begin with understanding where every student is. And so understanding through formative assessments what students know and what they don't know. And then I think the third is to continue to work out how to accelerate learning. And so if a student has fallen behind, let's say that they missed some of 4th grade. They don't need to repeat every single thing in 4th grade. Maybe they're now in 5th grade. what are the most essential standards that students need to learn so that they can access the content that is at their grade level that will fully stimulate them, engage them, excite them, and help them to move forwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. 네, 답변 고맙습니다. 이제 저희가 의견 한두 개 정도 소개해드리고 시간이
Okay, we will introduce 1 to 2 more comments, and I think we'll have to wrap up our Q&A session here. So we have listened to the insightful presentation from the 3 speakers, and there are many people saying thank you. So I really empathize with the need for digital education. It'd be good if there's various online education. This was a comment posted by Boram. And in case of math, it's very important that the right level, depending on the skills of the students, need to be offered. Thank you for the comments. I think this session was especially exciting and very productive. With the presentation made by the speakers, I think we thought about ways to narrow down the gap that is caused by the digital transition era. I would like to thank again to the speakers for your insightful presentations. So it's really exciting to follow up on your comments, and I think personally I'm learning a lot from your comments and questions. We are going to move on to the third session of Track A. We're going to have a 10-minute break, and we will see you again for the third session of Track A at 2:30. See you in a minute.